university is supposed to be a space for free thinking. At the same time, the university is also an institution. And like any other institution, through its various restrictive mechanisms, an institution attempts to restrict thought or tie it to a definite discourse. Hence, a university thrives on a disciplinary logic which restricts as well as produces the figure of the subject or the student as an obedient subject. And like the disciplinary apparatus of the state, the disciplinary apparatus of the university functions both through coercion and ideology. Sometimes it restricts the movement of our thoughts, sometimes it restricts our physical movements, the movements of our very bodies. And we also construct ourselves continuously in relation to these restrictions. We have been continuously experiencing such restrictions, such disciplining everywhere, both in and outside our university. But what do we mean when we say that our thoughts are disciplined, our ideas governed, and our voices stifled? In other words, we have to ask ourselves, and as students we believe it is our responsibility to ask the very basic and simple question, what is it to think? We might not have an easy and ready-made answer to this question, but this much we can say that to ask this question is to already engage in thinking. But when the very possibility to think becomes a challenge because the conditions for thought are systematically removed, how can we imagine to challenge the existing state of affairs? And yet thinking is an imperative we cannot let go of. So we must harbor a new thought, the thought of a disciplinary university which is continuously challenged by its margins, a university at its margins. Here we could make a distinction between the state of the university, which consists of the administrative authority, disciplinary boundaries and so on, and the university at its margins, which is both included in the university and yet excluded from it. It is that threshold which connects the exclusive and closed space of a university to the universal space of the outside world. The university at its margins refuses any conditions for learning and thinking. The margins produce new radical hypotheses and thereby deconstructs the idea of a disciplinary university. And it does this through powerful alternative assemblies of students who courageously imagine and create new possibilities of a different life. It is in the margins of the university, without validation from the authority in the form of grades and examinations, that the student affirms a life of intelligent thought and action. These alternative assemblies of students that take place in the margins are localized and subjective, meaning that they deal with specific questions of our times, respond to specific conditions, specific historical conditions. At the same time, it can be said that these local ideas have universal implications, which is to say that what we are thinking and speaking here and now is always already a universal which is at work here and now. The production of such ideas, which are singular, localized and yet universal, is perhaps the function of a true university. And so long as they are universal, such ideas are unconditionally available to all. It is this dialectic between the local and the universal that interests us because it redefines our position vis-a-vis the center. The dialectic between the margins and the center is reconstituted if we understand this new dialectical relationship between the universal concepts of equality and freedom and the particular realities of our times. This public seminar course is one such attempt to propose a new congregation of students who assemble out of pure interest, free from any institutional authority, to think about this new dialectic. Thank you, and I would like to call Sir to begin the seminar course.
Thank you very much, Secretary. And I will try my best to be true to this very courageous and very profoundly meaningful statement that all of you have put before us. I'll try my best. I'll see what I can do over the next 2 or 3 months. This is a course, so like any course, it's a journey. It's a search. It's a series of investigations. There are no guarantees. In fact, the only guarantee is that one will fail in most cases. But it's still worth the effort because the process of failing, the writer Samuel Beckett would say, fail but fail better. So that process itself is worth the effort, I think. And I, of course, also would say, really very sorry that we are not able to all sit together comfortably, and so many of you, and probably some are not able to come in. At the same time, I understand the difficulty of space, but I like the idea of doing it here in the Union Room, instead of doing it in the usual assigned spaces of public meetings. This is not a public meeting for one thing. It's a course, it's the first day, so I think it is better to have the sense or an orientation that we are doing it in one place every time, so that we know where to reach. But also the place being the Union Room, something I really like, and I'd like to thank the Union for having, been so generous and that I can come and talk to all of you here, which of course means I'm thanking all of you. So I like this idea. Apart from my personal, a little bit of nostalgia, spent so much time here in my own student days, very interesting times they were as they are now. But also the idea of a space which is still, to use Socrates, what she just used, the same word, still relatively unconditional. Because everyone else, the conditions of permission, the conditions in which you get permission, as we all know, they are so restrictive that it does tire you out. The very thought tires you out. Here, a sense of something unconditional, even if so crowded and we are not still able to all come in, that difficulty is there. But still, that this unconditional sense of coming together, it seems to me, is also worth, at least today, I'd like to start this with you here. So I like being here. So thank you again for that. So what I want to do is, with all of you, over 8 lectures are what I have proposed, and I have given out a series of themes that I want to take up in each class, and some readings. The readings, I have to already apologize in advance. I missed a few things, and it's just a select reading. I mean, there's so much else you could think of. So, for instance, anyone could object, or not object, but interject that why isn't Sharad Patil there in the readings? So, in fact, I would like to say that if you are able to carry on with this for some time, I'd like to invite my colleague Brahm Prakash someday to talk about Sharad Patil, because I know that he's working on Sharad Patil in a way that's really, at least for me, it's very useful discussing Sharad Patil with him. So I would like one or two such special classes in which some other people talk and we are all able to listen to them and have some more discussions. So that too is part of what I would like. Let's see how it goes. So yes, the idea of doing something on Ambedkar and Marx, at one level one doesn't need to justify this, because the reality of the presence of these two masters, these two great thinkers, is so overwhelming that we could just take off from the fact that this reality is something in which we all are placed. And we could just start the work, which I would like to do. I would like to just start the work and put ourselves in the middle of the thinking. Nevertheless, I have to say this much, that I do have a few preliminary remarks by way of looking at these two figures, Marx and Ambedkar, not in the sense that we use this term figure or person or personality, because it seems to me that when we speak of person or personality or figure, we are saying too much and saying too little. We are saying too much because we are already, in a way, monumentalizing them or fixing them in a form, in a shape, literally the shape of the person whose face, whose image we completely already identify with, or we are completely captured by the image. Marx's image, Ambedkar's image, these are great images, these are captivating images. But this captivation, any captivation obviously is also a challenge, because then we ask ourselves, can we really think in the presence of these masters? We can follow their thought, yes. But is it possible for us to think in the presence of these masters? In that sense, even before I've said anything, there's the challenge of equality with the master. To that extent, all mastery is also subject to something like a Declaration of Equality. But can we do it? So to that extent, we already say too much. And by saying too much, we can also make ourselves mute, partly mute, when we say Marx, Ambedkar, because their mastery is fixed. And we say too little. We say too little because we're still not asking the materialist question, the historical question. On what ground do these greatnesses emerge? What is the ground on which these singular, these unique, rare greatnesses, these great, not just people, not just men and women, but these great systems, these great insights, these great interventions in world history happen? So to that extent, it seems to me, the really patient and difficult task is to clear the ground so that we can literally enunciate these great names once more, Marx, Ambedkar. Instead of taking them for granted and their so-called monumental figures, their personalities, their mastery for granted, because in that case, we are bound to paralyze ourselves a little bit. And there will be very little for us to really do, apart from maybe repeating some key things they have said. So to that extent, I would take the second path as my initial, not really a methodological decision, but a kind of intuitive decision, which is not to talk of the masters, as these great personalities, which they are, no doubt, but to ask the question of the constitution of greatness. How is greatness to be constituted? In that sense, to put greatness at a distance and reconstitute the very process of how a system of thought, how knowledge is produced. So after all, when we speak of Marx and Ambedkar, we are concerned with knowledge. We are not concerned only with the obvious singularity and genius of individuals. That is there. But the genius is a function of some kind of knowledge, some kind of generation of ideas. And those ideas are not simply individual ideas, but they constitute a system. They constitute a full-fledged historical development of knowledge itself. So we speak of Marxism, today we speak of Ambedkarism. And that knowledge is also an instrument of action. And hence, these are all political thinkers. So to that extent, we are already asking a fundamental question of knowledge and action. Something like concept and politics. So I would like to make that ground my initial point of interest and clear the ground, because the ground is obviously not available to us as something which, in which something like a Marx, Ambedkar formula can be enunciated. There is no such formula. Now, of course, there is a Marx, Ambedkar vision or a Marx, Ambedkar dream. Also, there is a Marx, Ambedkar quarrel. Both are there. So I could actually write it down, but I've already written down a lot. We'll come to that. But I could write these two things down: the great Marx, Ambedkar quarrel and the great Marx, Ambedkar synthesis or dream. Let me put it that way: Marx, Ambedkar dream. Both are energizing images for us, because the quarrel makes us take positions this way or that way, and the dream makes us want something. So Marx, Ambedkar also stands for a desire for a greater politics, desire for a greater power of intervention in our present, which is highly dissatisfactory to all of us. This present which we need to intervene in, also we desire for something like a great Marx, Ambedkar synthesis. And in that very breath, we also desire a position in which we are not aggressed into taking a Marxist position or a completely determined position which is to be identified with Ambedkar. So in that sense, we want to also take a position which is singular, partisan, whether it's an Ambedkarite position or a position on the side of Marx. So to that extent, these great sides are also there. So both these things are happening at the same time. To that extent, this ground that I speak of is a ground on which these great figurations, these great dramas are being played, in which we have all come here today for very different reasons, surely. We don't have all the same reason to take interest in these things. But we are still here. Because I think it's a fair wager, that we are all somewhere part of this great garrulous drama. It's a serious drama. It's not something mockery at all. Nevertheless, These are stagings of the great Ambedkar-Marx synthesis of the dream, also the very energetic, the very contestatory Marx-Ambedkar quarrel. And you will notice that when I speak of the great Marx-Ambedkar quarrel or the great Marx-Ambedkar dream, I am not speaking through Marx's voice or Ambedkar's voice. I cannot. Because they are not here. I am speaking in my voice. Or, even better, I am speaking in our voice. In the sense that we are the ones, like Sukriti said, here and now. We occupy the here and now. To that extent, we have to take responsibility. It doesn't matter what position we take, which partisan subject we are, an Ambedkarite subject, a Marxist subject, or we have some kind of a great form of a machine, as it were, we make of the Marx, Ambedkar, or whoever else, Bhagat Singh, these kinds of configurations. All of this is possible, but there is one condition for this possibility, and that is something as the first clear statement of orientation, not methodological yet, but orientation. I'd like to make that statement clear, which is we must speak in our voice. There is no other choice. We cannot make Marx say it for us. We cannot make Ambedkar say it for us, because they are not here. We can cite them. We can make an arrangement of their thoughts in the way we see fit. But to make an arrangement is to make it in our voice. So that's the first responsibility that we must take. Now, having said that we must speak in our voice, let me immediately cite Ambedkar. To speak in our voice, to cite Ambedkar, paradoxically, is to actually form what Ambedkar calls a principle. A principle. A principle is that which is a thinkable form, which is an enunciation of an idea, a truth, but an enunciation in our voice, in one's own voice. So Ambedkar says in Annihilation of Caste, when he is discussing religion of rule and religion of principle, he says that principle is something for which we take responsibility, as different from rules which are given to us. So rules we follow, at the most we refuse to follow. But principles are what we take responsibility for. Principles are what we think on our own behalf. And insofar as we think, we also enunciate it, we formulate it. We put it in what could be called a discourse. And to that extent, it becomes the point of entry or the point of departure for knowledge. So you can have different kinds of principles. You can have a principle which is axiomatic, meaning you say that I make a principle, and then once I make the principle, I do not show it to be true. I take it to be true. A kind of a priori, an axiom. But you can also take a principle and then demonstrate the principle to be true. Define that principle. You can also define it. So there are different scientific ways of thinking about a principle. But still, this much is clear, that a principle is that for which we take responsibility. As different from a rule. Rules are repeatable structures which we perform. So rules are in that sense technical. Now the question is, for a rule, what is the principle? So that's why Ambedkar says in Annihilation of Caste, and it's one of the most lucid and comprehensive methodological compendiums to then use in different cases and problems. So Ambedkar says that when we follow rules, then we simply follow them. We don't ask what is the principle behind the rule. But when we think of a principle, then what we do is do the other thing, which is we actually have to find the right rule for the principle when we make a practical form out of it. So if it's a religion, and here religion means a social form broadly, then a social form of course needs rules. But we must make those rules according to the principle we have chosen. So to that extent, principle has two responsibilities coming along with it. The responsibility of the principle itself and the application of the principle to the right rule, to make the right rule, so that we can then create a kind of game So principles are also the building block toward games of society. So religion is also a kind of game when we perform certain acts which are religious acts. There are other games. Education is a game in which we perform certain acts that we know to be educational. But the principle of that education is important. Because that will determine what kind of an education is it. Is it the kind of liberal scientific education that we talk of today? Or is it education which is theological? There could also be a theological education. But the two have very different principles. But according to the two different principles, two different sets of rules and two different games of education will be prescribed. To that extent, we must ask the question of principle, not Ambedkar's principle or Marx's principle. We'll come to that. But first of all, the principle that we ourselves enunciate, we take responsibility for. And yeah.
There are a lot of students from various colleges, so if we would request you to take the class at the badminton court, we've talked to the people there.
All right.